Hello everyone and welcome to Kiki Crochet. In this video tutorial we're going to learn how to crochet the Tunisian smock stitch step by step. Now in order to create a Tunisian stitch we need a Tunisian stitch crochet hook. These hooks are special because they are long as a knitting needle. They have this stop in the back so when you collect the loops from the Tunisian stitch your loops don't come out. And in the front we have the hook that we regularly have in our crochet hooks. Now another different thing about this hook is that it does not have the little arch right here when we hold our regular crochet hooks to crochet. So in order to crochet the Tunisian stitch we have to hold the crochet hook as we hold a knife. Okay, so this is the only way to hold this hook. Now, in order to perform the Tunisian smock stitch, we need to have an even number of chains in the beginning. So you can make any number of chains that you prefer as long as it is an even number. So 10, 12, 14, 16, and so on. Okay? I've already started with my chain and I have a total of 20 chains to begin with. Now, the first loop counts as a stitch, as a loop on our hook. Okay, so we have our first loop over here which comes out from the first chain. Now put your hook in the second chain, take the yarn, pull it through and hold the loop on your hook. Put your hook in the third chain, take the yarn and hold the loop on your hook. So far we have 3 chains and 3 loops on our hook. Next chain, take the yarn and hold the loop on your hook. Next chain, grab the yarn and hold the loop on your hook. Next chain, hold the loop on your hook. Next chain, grab the yarn and hold the loop on your hook. Next chain, grab the yarn and hold the loop on your hook. Next chain, take the yarn and hold the loop on your hook. Next chain, same step. So you do the same exact step up until you finish all of your chains. Okay, so always put your hook in the next chain, take the yarn and hold the loop on your hook. This is why we need a long crochet hook when we are performing the Tunisian stitches. Okay, next chain, hold the loop on your hook. 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 Next chain, hold the loop on your hook, and our last chain and hold the loop on your hook. So we made 20 chains. That means that we have to have a total of 20 loops. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20 loops on our hook. So as many chains you have in the beginning, the same amount of loops you need to have in the end of the row. Okay, so now we're going to complete row number 1 by going back and crocheting through all of those loops. Now, when we start going back the row, take the yarn, wrap it around your hook once, and take it through the first loop only. Now from here on, up until the end, we are going to be crocheting 2 loops every time. So we only grab 1 loop only in the beginning when we're going backwards. So from now on, the first loop is the loop that we always have on our hook, and the second loop is the one that we want to crochet to perform the Tunisian stitch. So take the yarn and pull it through the next 2 loops. Okay, take the yarn through the next 2 loops, 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 next 2 loops, carefully, okay? Take the yarn through the next 2 loops, take the yarn through the next 2 loops, take the yarn through the next 2 loops, take the yarn through the next 2, take the yarn through the next 2 loops, take the yarn through the next 2 loops, next 2 loops, next 2 loops, next 2 loops. Now we're left with 2 loops on our hook and crochet them together. Okay, so this was row 1. We only do this for row 1. Now starting from row 2, it's going to be the beginning of our pattern. So starting row 2 and row 3 are going to be the repetitions up until we complete our project. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to wrap my yarn around my hook, but not counterclockwise, but clockwise. Okay, and when we do that, we use our index finger to hold the yarn so it doesn't leave our hook. So wrap the yarn around your hook clockwise, and with your index finger hold the yarn, hold the loop. So what I want to do now is I want to crochet through the first 2 loops of the Tunisian stitch of the first row. So these loops over here, 1 and 2, are my first 2 loops that I want to crochet through. Okay, we never try to put our hook through the very first loop, because for this loop we always have the loop on our hook, which is the one that we begin with. So wrap the yarn around your hook clockwise and put your hook through the first 2 loops, 1, 2. Now keep holding the loop that you took with your hook when you did it clockwise, because if you don't and you try to crochet, the yarn is going to come in front and you're not going to be able to take it through the 2 loops. Okay, so keep holding with your index finger the yarn that you wrapped. Now regularly counterclockwise, grab the yarn and pull it through those 2 loops, so you close them together to perform a V-stitch. Now again, clockwise, grab the yarn, hold it with your index finger and crochet the next 2 loops together. So this is what we're going to be doing up until the rest of the row. Okay, take the yarn and pull it through those 2 loops to close them together. So the reason that we're wrapping the yarn clockwise on our hook is because we're closing 2 stitches together. I need to have 2 loops on my hook when I finish crocheting those 2 stitches together. If I don't, that means that I'm working a decrease and our crochet project is going to look wrong. Okay, so because we're closing 2 stitches together, I'm wrapping the yarn clockwise, hold it with my index finger. I'm putting my hook through the next 2 loops. Keep holding the yarn with your index finger. Now take the yarn and pull it through those 2 loops. So I just created 2 loops on my hook. Okay, wrap the yarn around once, put your hook through the next 2 loops of the first row, grab the yarn and pull it through the 2 loops. So when we're grabbing the yarn to pull it through the 2 loops, we are always doing it counterclockwise. So take the yarn to hold it on your hook clockwise. When we want to take it through the loops down here, we're doing it counterclockwise. So grab the yarn, put your hook through the next 2 loops. Okay, grab the yarn, pull it through the 2 loops. Wrap the yarn around once clockwise, put your hook through the next 2 loops, take the yarn, pull it through the 2 loops to close them together. Wrap the yarn around once, put your hook through the next 2 loops, grab the yarn, pull it through those 2 loops. Wrap the yarn around once, put your hook through the next 2 loops, grab the yarn, pull it through the loops. Now I'm left with 3 loops of the Tunisian stitch in the end. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to wrap the yarn. I'm going to grab the next 2 stitches, grab the yarn, pull it through the 2 loops, and I'm left with 1 loop of the Tunisian stitch. And what I'm going to do to close this row, even though I'm only grabbing 1 stitch, I am going to wrap yarn and then do this step. Okay, even though I'm only grabbing 1 stitch, I'm only crocheting in 1 Tunisian stitch. So go ahead and wrap the yarn around your hook clockwise, put your hook through the last stitch, grab the yarn, pull it through the loop, and I've created 2 loops in the end as well. So this is how your row is supposed to look like. Okay, so now when we're going backwards, we are always crocheting in the same exact way. So always wrap the yarn around once and take it through the first loop only in the beginning, and from here on crochet 2 loops at a time. So take the yarn, next 2 loops, wrap the yarn around once, next 2 loops, next 2 loops. Okay, and keep doing this up until you crochet all the loops from your hook. Grab the yarn through the next 2 loops, 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 next 2 loops. Now be careful, because when we wrap the yarn clockwise on our hook, this loop tends to overlap to the other loop that we have on our hook. So make sure you do not crochet those 2 loops together. Make sure you're always grabbing only 1 loop from your work down here, and the 1 loop that we always have up here is the second loop that we're crocheting. Okay, so the 1 loop is the loop that's always on our crochet, on our crochet hook, and the second loop is the loop from the Tunisian stitch from the row that we just created. Grab the yarn, pull through the next 2 loops, grab the yarn, pull through the next 2 loops, grab the yarn, pull through 2, pull through 2, pull through 2, pull through 2, and pull through the last 2 loops. So this is how my work looks like when I have the second row completed. Now we're going to start the third row, which is the second and last row repetitions for this pattern. Now starting my third row, right here I have my first V-stitch right over here. Okay, it's my first V-stitch. This is the next V-stitch. So what I want to do, starting row number 3, I am going to grab the first loop of the first V-stitch and I'm going to crochet it by itself. Because what I want to do is I always want to be grabbing, I want to crochet together the second loop of the one V-stitch and the first loop of the next one. This way they're going to close together and they're going to form something that looks like a link. Okay, always grab the second loop of the one V-stitch and the first loop of the next one. Okay, second loop of the one V-stitch and the first loop of the second one. So let's go ahead and start. Okay, without wrapping yarn around my hook, this is the repetitions of row 3, which are always going to be made in the same way. Okay, without wrapping yarn around my hook, put your hook in the first loop of the first V-stitch over here. Put your hook in the first loop. Take the yarn and pull it through the loop. Now from here on, I'm going to be wrapping the yarn around my hook clockwise. Put your hook in the next 2 loops, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the second loop of the one V-stitch and the first loop of the next one. And take the yarn through those 2 loops. Wrap the yarn clockwise. Put your hook in the next 2 loops, and the next 2 loops are always going to be the second loop from the one V-stitch and the first loop of the other one. Okay, and close them together. Wrap the yarn clockwise, put your hook in the next 2 loops, and close them together. Wrap the yarn clockwise, put your hook in the next 2 loops, and close them together. Wrap the yarn clockwise, put your hook in the next 2 loops, and close them together. Wrap the yarn clockwise, put your hook in the next 2 loops, and close them together. Wrap the yarn clockwise, put your hook in the next 2 loops, and close them together. Wrap the yarn clockwise, put your hook in the next 2 loops, and close them together. Now I'm left with only 2 loops in the end of my row. So this is always going to happen when you do the repetitions of row 3. I'm left with the second loop of the last V-stitch, and I'm left with the last loop on the Tunisian stitch. So what I'm going to do, in the second from the last loop, I am going to wrap the yarn clockwise. I am going to grab this stitch only, and I'm going to crochet. And the last loop of the Tunisian stitch right over here, I am going to crochet by itself without wrapping yarn around my hook. The same thing as I did in the beginning. I crocheted the first loop of the first V-stitch by itself without wrapping yarn. So the same way I'm going to finish my row. I'm going to crochet my last loop of the Tunisian stitch by itself. Okay, so when we're going back the row, we are always doing the same thing. Take the yarn, pull it through the first loop, and from here on we're crocheting 2 loops together at a time. Next 2 loops, next 2 loops, take the yarn through the next 2 loops, take the yarn through the next 2 loops. Now see how this loop overlaps with the other one? Take the yarn through the next 2 loops, take the yarn through the next 2 loops, so we do this up until we finish the row. And the last 2 loops. Okay, so this is how my work looks like so far. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start row 4, which is going to be the repetitions of row number 2. So what did we do in row number 2? See right over here, this is our first V-stitch over here. So I am not going to mind the first loop of my first V-stitch. I'm not going to crochet at all in that loop. Okay, I'm going to wrap the yarn clockwise, and I'm going to go right ahead and grab the second loop of the first V-stitch and the first loop on the second V-stitch. And because I'm leaving out this first loop over here, and because I'm going right away in the second one, this is why in the end of the row, even though I'm crocheting in only 1 stitch, I also take the yarn clockwise and crochet it through the stitch, so I'm creating 2 loops in the end. And that happens because I'm leaving out the first loop of the first V-stitch. So this is the first V-stitch over here, and we are repeating the steps of row number 2. Okay, so wrap the yarn clockwise, and this is our first loop over here. Take the second loop of our V-stitch and the first loop of the next V-stitch and crochet them together. Now from here on, follow the same steps that we always do. Always grab the second and first loop of your V-stitches, okay? So wrap the yarn clockwise and take the next 2 loops. clockwise, through the next 2 loops, 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 and now I'm only left with the last loop of the Tunisian stitch, and even though it's only 1 loop, I'm going to wrap the yarn clockwise and take it through this loop, and I'm creating 2 loops even though I have 1 loop in the end. And this is because, as I mentioned in the beginning, we skip the first loop of the first V-stitch, so we want to create it in the end so we don't have less stitches than we're supposed to. Okay, so this is how my work looks like so far. Now, as we always do in the rows that we're going back, take the yarn through the first loop, and from here on take it through 2 loops up until you complete the row. 2 loops, next 2 loops, next 2 loops, next 2, next 2, next 2. Okay, all the way up until you complete the row. Now, this loop overlaps the one that I'm supposed to crochet through right now, so I'm just fixing it with my finger. Okay, always crochet through 2 loops up until you complete your row. And our last 2 loops. Now this is how our work looks like so far. Okay, and now we are going to start the repetitions of row number 3. We're doing row number 5, but we are following the steps that we did in row number 3. Now, our first V-stitch is the one right over here. This is my first V-stitch. So when I'm doing the repetitions of row number 3, I'm going to put my hook through the first loop of the first V-stitch, and I'm going to crochet by itself without wrapping yarn clockwise, okay? So I'm working through this Tunisian stitch regularly, and from here on, up until I finish the row, I'm going to be grabbing again the second stitch from the one V-stitch and the first from the other. This way you're closing those 2 loops together every time. Then again, the second loop from the one V-stitch and the first loop from the next one. And before we close the row, when we reach the second to the last Tunisian stitch, okay, which is the second loop from the last V-stitch over here, I'm going to wrap the yarn and crochet, wrap the yarn clockwise and crochet by itself this stitch, but I'm creating 2 loops, okay? And in the end, I'm going to crochet the last loop by itself without wrapping clockwise. So I'm beginning the row without wrapping, and I'm finishing the row without wrapping as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and start the repetitions of row number 3. So I am going to grab the first loop out of the first V-stitch over here. Take the yarn and pull it through the loop. Now from here on, wrap clockwise and take it through the next 2 loops. Clockwise 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 through the next 2 loops. Grab the yarn clockwise through the next 2 loops. Okay, so when we're doing the repetitions of row number 3, I'm left with 2 stitches in the end. Wrap your yarn clockwise and take it through the second before last loop and work your Tunisian stitch. And in your last Tunisian stitch, in your last loop, crochet without wrapping the yarn around your hook, the same way we did in the beginning. Now when we're going back, we're following the same steps, okay? So this is how your work looks like when you open it up on your hook. Now, take the yarn through the first 2 loops, and from here on, crochet 2 loops together every time. Okay, so we finished row number 5, which was the repetitions of row number 3. Now row number 6 is going to be the repetitions of row number 2. So from here on, I'm going off camera. I'm going to make a few more rows so we can see how the stitch looks like when we have a bigger piece, okay? So when we're doing the repetitions of row number 2, this is the first V-stitch of my row, okay? So when we're doing the repetitions of row number 2, we're skipping the first loop of the first V-stitch. I'm wrapping my yarn clockwise and go right ahead in the next 2 loops. And we always want to be grabbing the second loop of the one V-stitch and the first loop of the next one. So keep crocheting up until the end. And when you have crocheted the last 2 loops together, you're only left with your last loop of the Tunisian stitch, because we skipped the first loop in order to have it back on our loop. Okay, so we have the correct amount of stitches. Wrap your yarn clockwise and crochet your last loop. This is the repetitions of row number 2. When you're doing the repetitions of row number 3, you're going to follow the same steps as we just did. When you have your first V-stitch over here, put your hook through the first loop without wrapping the yarn clockwise. So we only want to have 1 loop over here, okay? Then keep crocheting 2 loops together. And in the end of the repetitions of row number 3, you're going to be left with 2 loops, 1, 2. When you're doing the second before last loop, you're going to wrap the yarn clockwise and take it through the stitch. This way we have 2 loops. And finish the row by crocheting through the last loop of the Tunisian stitch without wrapping the yarn. Okay, so we begin and we end row number 3 without wrapping the yarn. Okay, so go ahead and keep repeating rows 2 and 3 up until you complete your work. Now this is how our work looks like when we have completed a few more rows. Okay, so now in order to close your Tunisian work, okay, I'm going to frog this part over here because I have a few more yarn left, so I just want to show the last row on how to close your work, okay? So you have completed all of your rows. Now we're going to take loop by loop of our Tunisian stitch and we are going to close it with a slip stitch. So starting from your first V-stitch over here, grab the first loop of the V-stitch, grab your yarn, pull it through the loop and through the loop from your hook. Now your next loop, your second loop on your V-stitch, grab the yarn, pull it through the loop and through the loop of your hook. Okay, and continue working slip stitches same exact way up until you complete your row, and this is the last row of your work. Okay, so we're grabbing one loop at a time. In this way we have a nice edging in the end of our crochet project. Okay, we're almost done. And our last stitch. Now in order to close up, chain one, cut the yarn, pull the loop and tighten up. And this is how our work looks like. Now in a bigger piece, because the Tunisian stitch tends to fold, okay, in order to straighten it up, we never iron our crochet projects. In order to straighten it, we have to do the process of blocking. In order to block, you have to put it in a straight surface, pin it around and wet your piece, and when it dries out you're gonna have a straight piece the way it's supposed to be. Okay, so never iron, we always do the process of blocking. So thanks for watching, please subscribe, and if you like the video please press like and leave a comment. Thanks again, bye bye.